didn't howl. It screamed like a dying horse. Abigail stood knee-deep in freezing mud, watching the wagon train disappear into the blinding white. They'd left her. Too heavy, too slow. Now, a single crooked chimney plumed smoke against the tree line. Survival meant begging a stranger for the dirt floor. The cold didn't just bite, it chewed. It gnawed through the damp, heavy wool of Abigail's skirts and sank its teeth directly into the marrow of her shins. Every step was an argument with gravity. Her lungs, burning with the effort, pulled in air that tasted sharply of iron and crushed ice. She paused, leaning her substantial bulk against the rough, freezing bark of a dead ponderosa pine. Her thighs chafed, raw and weeping beneath the sodden layers of her petticoats. For 24 years, her body had been a subject of public commentary, a source of profound, suffocating shame. Eats like a teamster, moves like a glacier, her uncle used to say. Mules are struggling, Abby. Josiah Cobb, the wagon master, had muttered just 3 hours ago, refusing to meet her eyes. You're taking up the space of two and walking half the pace. We beat the blizzard, or we all die. They had left her a small sack of hardtack and pointed her toward a thin ribbon of smoke winding up into the slate-gray sky. A merciful abandonment, Josiah had called it. Abigail wiped her nose with a frozen mitten. The canvas fabric scraped against her chapped upper lip, leaving a smear of pink blood. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel a sudden, surging will to live. She felt angry, exhausted, and desperately, humiliatingly heavy. The cabin emerged from the whiteout like a rotting tooth pushing up through the snow. It was small, built of unpeeled logs caulked with mud that was rapidly freezing into stone. A dilapidated lean-to clung to the side of the structure, from which the miserable, low bray of a mule sounded. The smell of wood smoke hung thick in the air, carrying the faint, rich scent of rendering fat. Abigail's stomach twisted with a violent, hollow cramp. She dragged her boots through the drifts, her skirts caked in a thick armor of frozen mud and ice. By the time she reached the heavy, plankwood door, she was trembling so violently she could barely lift her hand. She knocked. It was a pathetic sound, barely louder than the rattling of the leather hinges in the wind. She waited. The snow piled on her shoulders. Panic, hot and sour, rose in her throat. She knocked again, harder, her numb knuckles cracking against the wood. The door swung inward with a sudden, violent yank. Abigail stumbled forward, nearly collapsing over the threshold. A hand, large and calloused, shot out and caught her by the front of her heavy coat, arresting her fall with terrifying ease. God Almighty, a voice grunted. Abigail looked up, her vision blurred by melting snow and frozen eyelashes. The man holding her up wasn't tall, but he was built like a keg of black powder. He wore a heavy canvas coat, slick with old grease and soot, and a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a comb since the spring thaw. He smelled strongly of wet wool, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of raw meat. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask where she came from. He simply dragged her inside and kicked the door shut against the howling storm, throwing a heavy iron latch into place. The silence inside was immediate and deafening, broken only by the violent crackle of the hearth fire and the ragged, wet sound of Abigail's own breathing. "Wagon train?" the man asked. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any warmth or pity. He released her coat, and Abigail swayed, suddenly hyper-aware of the puddle of muddy water forming around her boots on his packed dirt floor. "Yes," she managed to croak. Her throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. They moved on. The man, Caleb, though she wouldn't know his name until later, stared at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, like the winter sky outside. He didn't look at her with the familiar mixture of disgust and pity she was used to. He looked at her the way a man looks at a broken wagon wheel or a split axe handle. An inconvenience. A problem of physics. "Left you," he stated. It wasn't a question. Abigail's cheeks burned, a flush of deep, familiar shame radiating through her frozen skin. She instinctively tried to cross her arms, to pull her coat tighter around her thick waist, to somehow shrink herself down. It was a reflex born of a lifetime of apologizing for taking up space. I can work," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I can mend. I can cook. I just need a place out of the wind." She gestured weakly toward the wall shared with the lean-to. "I don't need the fire. I'll sleep in the barn. Please." Caleb turned away from her, walking toward the hearth to prod the burning logs with an iron rod. Sparks showered up the blackened chimney. "Ain't got a barn. Got a lean-to." "The lean-to, then," Abigail pressed, her voice cracking. I'm thick enough. The cold won't take me as quick. Just let me lay in the hay. I won't be a bother." It was a lie. She was freezing to death right here by the fire. But the thought of staying in this tiny, stifling room with this hard-eyed stranger, the thought of taking up half his floor space, of him having to step around her heavy, clumsy body was somehow more terrifying than the frostbite. She wanted to hide. Like a sick animal, she just wanted to crawl into the dark and be ignored. Caleb set the iron rod down. The clank of metal against stone was sharp. He turned around, leaning his weight against the rough stone of the mantelpiece. "My mule's out there. He's mean, he kicks, and he smells worse than I do," Caleb said flatly, "and it's dropping to 20 below tonight." "I'll sleep in the barn," the obese girl begged, her voice dropping to a harsh, humiliated whisper as she stared at her mud-caked boots. She hated the tremor in her chin. She hated that she was begging. Caleb walked toward her, his heavy boots silent on the dirt. He stopped 2 feet away. He smelled heavily of pine resin and old smoke. "No, you won't," he said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You'll sleep next to me, nearest the hearth. It's the only place in this shack you won't lose toes by morning." The pronouncement hung in the dense, smoky air. "You'll sleep next to me." Abigail's head snapped up. Her heart gave a violent, panicked thud against her ribs. She scoured his face for a leer, a threat, some hidden predatory intent. But Caleb was already turning away, dismissing her reaction before she even made it. There was nothing romantic or sinister in his eyes, only the cold, brutal pragmatism of a man who knew exactly what winter did to soft flesh. "Get those wet layers off," Caleb ordered over his shoulder. He moved to a small, rough-hewn table, cluttered with skinning knives and tin cups. "Before the wet freezes to your skin, you'll find a blanket on the cot." Abigail stood frozen, her wet clothes clinging to her like an icy shroud. The cabin was scarcely 10 feet by 12. The cot was a raised platform of lashed birch branches covered in a thick, mangy buffalo hide, sitting directly adjacent to the fieldstone hearth. It was the only furniture in the room meant for sleeping. The rest of the space was swallowed by a cord of stacked firewood, a few crates of provisions, and the table. There was nowhere to hide, no screen to step behind. "I can't," she whispered. Caleb paused, a tin coffee pot in his hand. He looked back at her, his brow furrowing in genuine irritation. "You can't what? Undress? Your hands frost-nipped?" "No. I can't undress. Here." She swallowed hard, gesturing vaguely to the small room. She felt her face burn hotter than the roaring fire. I am not a small woman, sir. It isn't proper." Caleb set the pot down with a heavy clunk. He dragged a hand down his face, the sound of calloused skin scraping against stiff beard hair, loud in the quiet room. "Lady," he sighed, the word sounding foreign and awkward in his mouth. "I trap beaver for a living. I spend 6 months of the year talking to a mule. I don't care if you're built like a sparrow or a draft horse. If you leave that wet wool on, you'll catch pneumonia. You'll die on my floor, and the ground is too hard for me to dig a grave until April. Take the damn coat off." He didn't turn around to give her privacy. He just walked out the back door into the howling storm, pulling it shut behind him to fetch more wood, leaving her alone in the sudden, startling heat of the cabin. Abigail let out a shaky breath, the tension leaving her shoulders in a rush. Her hands, trembling and clumsy from the cold, fumbled with the bone buttons of her heavy wool coat. It took her 3 agonizing minutes to peel the sodden garment off. It hit the dirt floor with a wet, heavy slap. Next came the ruined petticoats, the hems frayed and heavy with freezing mud. Underneath, she wore a simple, coarse cotton dress. It was stained with sweat and dirt from weeks on the trail, pulling uncomfortably tight across her broad shoulders and thick waist. She stood there, shivering despite the fire, feeling entirely exposed. She was hyper-aware of the flesh of her arms, the roll of her stomach, the sheer, undeniable mass of herself. Josiah Cobb's voice echoed in the back of her mind, taking up the space of 2. The door banged open, letting in a swirl of snow. Caleb stepped back inside, his arms loaded with split pine. He kicked the door shut, ignoring the snow melting off his boots. He dumped the wood unceremoniously next to the hearth, brushing the sawdust from his coat. He looked at Abigail, standing awkwardly by the table in her damp dress. He didn't avert his eyes, but his gaze didn't linger on her waist or her chest. He looked at her bare hands, red and swollen, and her lips, still tinged with blue. He walked to the cot, grabbed a massive, heavy gray blanket made of rough wool, and tossed it at her. It hit her in the chest. "Wrap up," he muttered. "Coffee's boiling." Abigail caught the blanket, pulling it instantly around her shoulders. It smelled like dust and dried sage, but it was dry. She pulled it tight, burying herself in it, finally feeling a tiny measure of security. Caleb poured 2 tin cups of black, sludgy coffee. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. His skin was rough like sandpaper, calloused and hot. Hers were still icy. She took the cup, wrapping both hands around the searing tin. The pain was immediate and excruciating, the agonizing burn of blood forcing its way back into frozen capillaries. Abigail bit the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth. Caleb watched her over the rim of his cup. "Hurts," he noted. "Yes," she ground out, tears of sheer physical pain pricking her eyes. "Means the tissue ain't dead. You're lucky." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Name's Caleb." Abigail. She didn't offer her surname. Out here, surnames felt like unnecessary weight. She had already dropped enough weight by being abandoned. "Well, Abigail, you can sit on the edge of the cot. Heat rises, but it also stays close to the stone. Floor's too cold to sit on." Abigail hesitated, looking at the narrow bed. "And you?" "I'll sit on the crate," he said, pulling a wooden box of ammunition closer to the fire. He sat down heavily, resting his forearms on his knees, staring into the flames. She slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the cot. The buffalo hide was rough beneath her, but the radiant heat from the massive fieldstone hearth was heavenly. The silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. The storm outside battered the log walls, a constant, violent reminder of what she had just escaped. Abigail sipped the coffee. It was bitter, strong enough to strip paint, and exactly what she needed. The hot liquid hit her empty stomach, causing a loud, involuntary, and deeply embarrassing rumble to erupt from her midsection. She clamped her hand over her stomach, her cheeks flaring red again. Caleb didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He simply reached over to a small cast-iron skillet sitting on the edge of the hearth. Inside were cold, congealed drippings and a few chunks of salt pork. He pulled a piece of hardtack from a tin, threw it in the pan, and pushed it closer to the embers. "Fat'll keep you warm," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the fire. "Ain't much, but it's dense." Abigail watched the grease slowly begin to liquefy and pop around the hard bread. She looked at the man sitting on the crate. He wasn't a hero. He hadn't saved her out of the goodness of his heart. He had just refused to let her die on his doorstep. Yet, as the smell of frying salt pork filled the small cabin, replacing the scent of her own wet, sour fear, Abigail felt a strange, terrifying knot tighten in her chest. She was safe. For tonight, at least. But as she looked at the narrow cot, and the single hearth, and the sprawling, cynical mountain man who had claimed she would sleep beside him, she realized the storm outside might be the least of her problems. By nightfall, the cabin's interior had shrunk. The shadows, thrown long and violent by the sputtering hearth, swallowed the corners of the room. Outside, the blizzard didn't weaken. It settled into a steady, rhythmic battering against the timber, sounding like heavy dirt hitting a coffin lid. The cold began to win. It seeped through the mud chinking, turning the dampness in the air into a bitter, biting frost. The puddle from Abigail's boots had frozen solid into a dirty lens of ice. Caleb fed the last of the split pine into the fire, banking the coals with gray ash to make them last. The orange glow dimmed, and the temperature in the room plummeted with terrifying speed. "Time," Caleb said. He didn't look at her. He simply unlaced his heavy boots, towing them off near the hearth. He kept his wool trousers and his grease-stained canvas shirt on. Abigail sat rigidly on the edge of the birch branch cot, the heavy wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Her stomach had stopped cramping after the salt pork, but a new, sharper knot had formed in her chest. The cot was narrow, barely 3 feet wide. Caleb walked over, carrying 2 more heavy, stiff buffalo hides. They smelled violently of musk, dirt, and old blood. He tossed them onto the cot. "Lie down," he ordered, his voice flat. He wasn't asking. He was instructing her on how not to die. Abigail's throat clicked as she swallowed. She swung her thick legs onto the mattress. The birch branches groaned loudly under her weight. The sound was a physical blow to her pride. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sigh, the muttered insult, the shift of disgust. Nothing came, just the rustle of heavy hides. She lay stiff on her side, facing the wall of the cabin, pressing herself so close to the rough logs that the bark bit into her shoulder. She tried to make herself small. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling her spine, desperately trying to leave him as much space as possible. She felt the mattress dip sharply behind her as Caleb climbed in. The heavy hides were thrown over them both, trapping the air, plunging them into a suffocating, heavy darkness. For 10 minutes, the silence was agonizing. Abigail breathed shallowly, terrified that the simple expansion of her ribs would cause her back to brush against him. Her outer thigh, pressed against the frozen log wall, began to ache with a deep, bone-deep ache. The chill radiating from the wood was relentless, biting through her cotton dress. She began to shiver. It started small, a tremor in her jaw, then spread to her shoulders, until her entire massive frame was vibrating under the hides. "You're shaking the bed apart." Caleb's voice was a low gravel rumble right behind her ear. I'm sorry," she chattered, her teeth clicking together. "I'm trying to stay. Over." Caleb let out a short, harsh breath through his nose. "You're pressing yourself against an outside wall in 20 below weather. You're acting like a fool." Before she could form an apology, a heavy, calloused hand gripped her hip. She gasped, a sharp, panicked sound, as Caleb hauled her backward. He was shockingly strong. He didn't grope. He moved her with the rough, utilitarian force of a man shifting a sack of grain. He pulled her solid back flush against his broad chest. Abigail froze, every muscle locking up. She was acutely aware of her own mass, her broad hips pressed against his thighs, her thick back filling the space of his chest. She waited for him to push her away, to realize the sheer size of what he had pulled against him. Instead, he threw a heavy, muscular arm over her thick waist, hauling her tighter against him. He locked his knees behind hers, forcing her legs to bend with his. "Stop fighting the physics of it," he muttered into the nape of her neck. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of the bitter coffee and salt pork. "I ain't got the energy to thaw a corpse tomorrow. Share the heat." He was a furnace. The heat radiating off his body was immediate and staggering. It bled through his canvas shirt and her cotton dress, seeping into her frozen skin. It was an invasive, intimate warmth. Abigail lay rigid, terrified to move, terrified to breathe. She had spent her entire adult life apologizing for her body. She had bound her waist until she bruised, starved herself until she fainted, and yet she remained hopelessly, undeniably large. Men didn't hold her. Men stepped around her. Yet Caleb held her with a grip that was entirely devoid of pity. He didn't hold her like a woman. He held her like a lifeline. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent shivering stopped. The heat from his chest thawed the ice in her spine. The heavy arm across her stomach, thick with an insulating layer of fat she despised, felt incredibly, strangely anchoring. He wasn't shifting away from her softness. He was sinking into it, utilizing it. "You ain't freezing anymore," Caleb noted, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "No," she whispered into the dark. "Good. Your fat holds the heat better than my bones do. Keep it there." It was the most brutal, unromantic thing a man had ever said to her. And yet, lying there in the dark, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off, Abigail felt a hot, unexpected tear slide down her cheek, catching in the coarse wool of the blanket. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of utility. For the first time in her life, her weight wasn't a burden. It was a weapon against the cold. It was keeping them both alive. She let out a long, shaky breath, and for the first time since the wagon train abandoned her, her muscles finally went slack against the mountain man's chest. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them in the suffocating 10 by 12 box. Time lost its shape, measured only by the dwindling pile of firewood and the scrape of the iron skillet on the hearth. The cabin smelled of wood ash, unwashed bodies, and boiling pinto beans. It was a thick, human smell, devoid of any frontier romance. It was the smell of survival. Abigail didn't cower. The proximity that had terrified her the first night had bred a strange, blunt familiarity. She had taken over the hearth. It wasn't an act of subservience, but of profound practicality. Caleb's hands were clumsy with the beans. He burned the bottom of the pot. Abigail, armed with a wooden spoon and a fierce, unspoken need to earn her space, didn't let a single kernel scorch. On the 4th afternoon, the wind finally broke. The howling died to a low, defeated whistle through the eaves. Pale, watery sunlight sliced through the single grease paper window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy air. Abigail sat on the crate, an old, torn canvas tarp draped over her lap. Caleb had tossed it to her that morning along with a bone needle and a spool of heavy waxed thread. He had a tear in his winter coat, right under the armpit. She worked in silence. Her fingers, thick but incredibly deft, pushed the heavy needle through the stiff canvas. She pulled the waxed thread taut, the subtle zip sound rhythmically filling the quiet room. Caleb sat on the cot, running a whetstone down the blade of his skinning knife. The metallic scrape, shk, shk, was hypnotic. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words all day. He just watched her. Abigail felt his eyes on her. It made her skin prickle. She adjusted her posture, instinctively trying to suck in her stomach, smoothing her cotton dress over her broad thighs. The habit was ingrained, a reflex born of endless, judging stares. "You're ruining the stitch," Caleb said suddenly. Abigail jumped, the needle slipping and pricking her thumb. A tiny bead of dark red blood welled up. "What?" "You shifted," Caleb said, pausing the whetstone. He pointed the blade at her lap. "You pulled your arms in tight. Throws off your leverage. You're going to snap the needle, and I only got 3 left." Abigail stared at him, her cheeks flooding with heat. She pressed her bleeding thumb to her lips, tasting the sharp copper. I was just sitting up straight." "You were trying to shrink," Caleb corrected bluntly. He set the knife and stone down on the buffalo hide. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his pale gray eyes fixed on her. "Been watching you do it for 3 days. You walk around the shack like you're trying not to cast a shadow." Abigail's breath hitched. The raw honesty felt like a slap. She looked down at the canvas, her vision suddenly blurring. "It is a small cabin, Caleb. I am trying to stay out of your way." "You ain't in my way." "Josiah Cobb said I took up the space of 2, she blurted out. The words tore from her throat before she could stop them, thick with venom and a decade of humiliation. "He said the mules were dying because I was too heavy, that I was a burden on the train. He was right. Look at me." She dropped the canvas, gesturing angrily at her own thick waist, her broad shoulders, the heavy slope of her breasts. "I am a burden." Caleb didn't blink. He didn't look away out of politeness. He looked at her body, evaluating it with the same cold, pragmatic stare he used to judge a beaver pelt or a coming snowbank. "Josiah Cobb is a dead man," Caleb said softly. Abigail froze. "What?" "That train was pushing for the pass. The storm hit 3 hours after they left you. Snow's 10 feet deep up there by now. If they didn't freeze, the avalanches buried them." Caleb picked up the whetstone again, turning it slowly in his rough hands. They were moving fast, burning hot. Lean men, skinny mules, no fat, no reserves. He looked up, meeting her tear-filled eyes. "You didn't survive that walk because I pulled you in here," Caleb said, his voice dropping its usual gravelly edge, becoming something terrifyingly earnest. "You survived because you had the meat on your bones to keep your core hot while you walked." Cobb looked at you and saw a slow mule. He was a fool. "You ain't a burden, Abigail. Out here, where the world tries to kill you every single night, you're ballast." Abigail sat paralyzed. The canvas slipped from her lap onto the dirt floor. She had been called many things: glutton, sow, spinster, pity case. But she had never, in 24 years, been called a survival asset. Caleb stood up. He walked over to her, his heavy boots making no sound on the packed dirt. He stopped right in front of her. He smelled of whetstone oil and old sweat. He reached down, picking up the fallen canvas coat. He held it out to her. "Needle's dulling," he said, pointing to the seam. "Push harder. Use your weight behind it." He didn't touch her face. He didn't offer a gentle smile. But as their eyes met, the cynical, hardened barrier between them cracked. Abigail took the coat, her thick fingers brushing his calloused ones. "All right," she whispered, her voice rough. She shifted her weight on the crate, settling her heavy hips firmly into the wood. She didn't suck in her stomach. She didn't try to hide her shoulders. She gripped the canvas, pushed the bone needle through the thick fabric, and leaned her substantial weight into it. The needle slid through with a satisfying, solid thwack. Caleb watched her for a moment longer. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. He turned and walked to the heavy timber door. He threw the iron latch and pulled it open. The cold air rushed in, crisp and blindingly bright, sweeping away the stale smoke. The world outside was a terrifying, frozen, white ocean. But inside, the fire cracked, the beans boiled, and Abigail kept sewing. The winter would last for months. The food would run low, and the cold would test the very marrow of their bones. But as Abigail pulled the thread taut, stitching the torn canvas back together, she knew one thing for certain. When the spring thaw finally came, turning the frozen mud back into rivers, she wouldn't be walking back down the mountain. She had found her place by the hearth. That's just the beginning of Abigail and Caleb's harsh, unforgiving winter in the high country. Will survival forge something deeper than just necessity, or will the ghosts of the trail tear them apart? If you felt the chill of the cabin and the warmth of the hearth, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates a raw, real Western tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for part 3 and 4. We've got more grit coming your way.